Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are once again in the European Parliament here in Brussels, and in today's programme we'll be talking about the importance of the forthcoming European parliamentary elections and why it's so important that all of us get involved and actually vote and get behind some of our candidates who've made a real stand with Israel and the Jewish people during the course of the last parliament. And in today's programme, I'm just joined by Thomas Sandel, the founder and the director of the European Coalition for Israel. Thomas, sadly, it's just you and me today. So many of our guests have fallen like flies, but not surprising considering that all the MEPs in this parliament are gearing up into campaign mode.
Yeah, obviously, that's where they ought to be at this point in time. I mean, this is their time of reality check, going out, meeting the electorate, getting their message across. And very few, as we've seen today, are actually in the European Parliament today, because with only some 7 months to go, as we hear, it's really showtime for them to reach out and to win the trust of the electorate again.
And Thomas, can you give us an update? I know that you only yesterday met with the Middle East representative within Catherine Baroness Ashton's office to do with the EU guidelines.
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned in this program before, we have this open letter which was dealing with the EU guidelines which were issued in December, passed in December, which are clearly limiting Israeli activities in the disputed territories in a way which we believe are very counterproductive to peace, very counterproductive to bringing the two parties together, and most of all, very counterproductive as it relates to the interest of the Palestinian people. And we mentioned this example before. You take the case of SodaStream, employing thousands of people in the disputed territories, giving the Palestinian people 3 times as much in salary as they would otherwise get. And still, this seems to be the obstacle of peace. And we handed over the first draft of the open letter already in November when we had the annual conference. In the meantime, we collected 43 signatures of very respected senior political leaders in Europe to prove the point that this is not only an ECI message. There's a broad support and constituency on the highest political level in Europe against this, what we consider to be very uneven approach of the European Union to the Middle East process.
Because surely when we actually look at the details of the guidelines, essentially summing up, they are guidelines that the EU has issued to say that this is the green line and really to ban products and services produced in Judea and Samaria, in Jerusalem, and also in the Golan Heights. And so therefore have a whole unified European ban on those products and services. But surely what that does is it just reinforces or supports the whole boycott, divestments and sanctions campaign against Israel, and essentially seems that the European Commission have just swallowed that up and followed and pursuing that policy rather than playing an even-handed approach to the conflict.
It's interesting, Simon, you would mention that because of confidentiality and being discreet, I'm not going to mention names in this program, but the discussion we had yesterday with the European External Action Service, which is the foreign service of the European Union, if you wish, they made a point actually to say that, legally speaking, as they look at it, these territories and the activities have always been against EU policy. So the question was more, why did they implement the guidelines at this particular point in time? And there was an interesting mentioning in this discussion, which I think is relevant for us. They basically said that, listen, this has been a status quo for quite some time, but some 3 years ago, things changed, and there was a civil society mobilization. They mentioned the UK in particular, which managed to sway the opinion of the government of Britain. So the point is to say that something has happened within the last 3 years where the BDS boycott, divest movement has grown much stronger, to the point that the European Union policies today are being dominated by this particular force. What is even more deceitful is the fact that the European Union and many European Union member state governments, such as the Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, are supporting these NGOs which are pushing a very radical boycott message against Israel. So whereas the governments, and even here the European Union, would say, well, we are in no way calling for a boycott, you know, with the left hand they are secretly supporting these NGOs, and then, you know, with the right hand they say, well, you know, we have nothing to do with it because this is not our policy. So this is a form of relationship between certain civil society groups, anti-Israeli civil society groups, and particular governments that have brought us to the point where we are today, which is sadly a very disappointing place for us to be, seeing the EU coming so strongly against Israel, against any Israeli presence in the disputed territories in particular.
You know, because if we actually consider the makeup and the geography of that area between the State of Israel and that of the kind of Palestinian Authority, what we find very surprising is that 10% of Israel's population is actually Arab, and yet it seems very, very clear that in any kind of future Palestinian state, the Palestinians themselves don't want any Jewish settlements. They don't want any Jews in their communities, certainly essentially saying Juden-free area, despite the kind of biblical claims and the biblical connection to the Jewish people of those lands in cities like Hebron and others. So it seems that this is really working against bringing the two sides towards peace, and certainly against the spirit of the Oslo Accords, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. No, absolutely, and we pointed out these facts again yesterday. Interestingly, I would say still is that we made some 8 points in this open letter, and we'll publish the open letter shortly so everyone can read for themselves. But it's interesting that the European Union officially would not disagree on any of the 8 points. They said basically, well, these are, you know, we hear you loud and clear, and we think your points are valid and should be taken into consideration. We are not disputing any of these points. Still, their conclusions are completely opposite to our conclusions. This is almost like a dilemma. How can we miscommunicate so on such a great scale that we can say on the one hand we are in complete agreement, but when you look at the policy expressions of the European Union, they are in complete opposition to anything that we are saying. So I think on the one hand, you know, we should be pleased to understand that what we have, together with our legal counsel, Andrew Tucker, who's been on this program many times, that what we have put together is something which resonates very well on the highest political level here in Europe. And they mentioned again yesterday, they said, well, we are sure that Cathy Ashton is aware of these arguments. The same with the US Foreign Secretary John Kerry. If this is not the case, we will certainly convey these arguments from you as an expression of a European civil society articulation. So in this respect, I think as ECI, as European Coalition for Israel, and all of those who are working together with us, we can be happy and content that at this end of the 5th year term, we know the European Parliament and all the important positions here in Brussels they're elected for a 5-year term. And as this 5-year term is coming to an end, and that's why we are here in the studio today, this is our audit to say, listen, we don't think that you have been a fair mediator in the Middle East, but these are specifically the points where I think you are failing, and the document that goes with the open letter is then substantiating our arguments to say, well, this is the background and these are the facts that you need to take into consideration.
And can the European Parliament play any role in kind of scrutinising the foreign service of the EU, as it were? Is there anything they can do, or is there some MEPs that can write a particular letter or ask particular questions to ensure that there's fairness and this isn't seen to be favouring one side, but the EU is actually taking a position of where they can be kind of neutral in this side, particularly much like the American position, in order to try and bring about talks and just allow those talks to develop between the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves?
Yeah, as this is an election special, let me just in a few words explain how foreign policy is shaped in Brussels.
That'd be very useful.
Yes, and it's important to know that still to this day, foreign policy is primarily on the responsibility of the national governments. So we cannot neglect London, we cannot neglect Helsinki or Stockholm or Madrid or any other national capital. This is at the end of the day where foreign policy is formulated. It is then brought to Brussels, to what is called the Council, basically the member state governments coming into a conference room and trying to formulate a common approach, in this case, vis-à-vis the Middle East conflict. The interesting thing is, of course, that in the Council, the meetings are still not transparent. So as a citizen, you cannot ask the question, well, what did my government say on this particular issue in the Council? There's no way for us to know. Well, we can know by speaking to diplomats. We can know by speaking off the record to people and say, well, how did the discussion go? But by and large, there's no way that you can put your government, make your government responsible and say, well, why are you pushing this line in Brussels? And this, because this is exactly the point that was made yesterday, to say, well, we are actually doing, as the European External Action Service, we are doing what your governments are asking of us. So the foreign minister would typically meet twice a year to a particular summit where they formulate the most important policy recommendations for the year. So they go back to say, well, in December 2013, the Council agreed on these principles. And most people pay no attention to those principles, and most of the times they are not implemented. But as we know about the EU guidelines, they were presented on the table exactly today when the European Parliament was closing for the summer, which was the same for any other national parliament. And we were saying, listen, this is not fair, this is not transparent, this is not good governance. And that brings me to the European Parliament, because obviously you can say the European Parliament then is the watchdog of the Council and of the Commission that will try to keep a check and balance on how they are operating. And this is why it is important that we get the right people in the European Parliament who can raise these issues directly with the civil servants. And we've seen in some of our conferences when we would typically bring in the civil servants from the European Commission, the External Action Service, and then members of parliaments, how there are cases where our friends in the European Parliament has been very upfront, basically telling them, well, how dare you? You are our servants, you are civil servants. You are not the ones to make policy decisions. How dare you present guidelines just the day that we are closing this parliament? So there is, although, as I said, foreign policy primarily is formulated in the national capitals, there is a growing importance for the European Parliament, and that is why it's so important that we have the right people here who are knowledgeable, who are courageous and dare to stand up against that which we consider to be an unbalanced EU approach.
Absolutely. I think also, Thomas, I think it's very important to mention the fact that the Lisbon Treaty, which was the redesigned European Constitution, has given more power to the European External Action Service to actually make independent foreign policy free of national government. So, of course, during the last few years, we've seen Europe as a whole taking decisions in terms of foreign policy, in terms of relations with the Middle East, more independently than national governments coming together and deciding what their policy should be in. And certainly Europe takes a position, a very much of a soft approach rather than using any kind of military force that we've seen with the Iranian negotiations. So is this really helpful, considering our own national governments of member states are losing their influence and control over their foreign policy, because it's now the EU Commission that's more dictating European foreign policy, also driving the foreign policy of national governments across Europe?
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good point and a good example of questions that should be asked these next weeks before the European election, which is, by the way, is between the 22nd and the 25th of May. These are exactly the type of issues that should be debated. People can be of different opinions. For the democratic process, it's most important that we know where the candidates stand. So if you have a particular conviction on that issue, you should press your candidate and say, well, where do you stand? So when you vote, and everyone will just have to vote, everyone who watches this program, we give no excuses but to to vote in May. But you also vote, you are informed about where your candidates stand. My personal opinion, for whatever it is worth, and I'm not shy about expressing it, is that I believe it's in the interest of Israel. I believe it's in the interest of our national governments not to have a coordinated foreign policy. I dare to say that, and I think it's a legitimate opinion. What we've seen, say in the United Nations, because there you have the same dynamics, the European Union typically try to have a common opinion or approach. Take the example of the Palestinian unilateral statehood bid. But very seldom it then needs consensus. And, you know, we're now talking about 28 member states, you know, from the north to the south, from the east to the west, from small, newly independent country to large old democracies as France and Great Britain and Germany. So it's very difficult to achieve consensus. But I believe that this is actually in the interest of the member states. If we look at Israel in particular, I believe it's in the interest of Israel to have a Europe where national governments can be of different opinion. And while they dare to express their different opinions, it means that the EU will not have one coordinated line. So, as is the case in the United Nations, it then means that at a certain point, Baroness Ashton will give up and say, well, on this particular vote, we want to give you...
Would, I think.
we will give you the freedom to vote as you choose.
Yeah, and we now have this advert to go to, which highlights the forthcoming European parliamentary elections.
On the road to the European elections. The next European elections will take place between the 22nd and 25th of May 2014. Each country is free to set their election day within this period. Every citizen of voting age in the European Union will be able to elect the politicians they would like to represent them at European level. These are the members of the European Parliament, or MEPs. The Parliament is the only European institution whose members are directly elected by citizens. But not all citizens exercise their right to vote. It is only compulsory to vote in 4 countries. Everywhere else, it's currently optional. Thus, in 2009, the average turnout in Europe was 43%. But if we look more in detail, we can see that the rate varies from one country to another. In Slovakia, for example, 1 in 5 voters cast their vote. However, even though the vote is not compulsory in Malta, 80% turned out, and over 65% of Italians voted. There are some rules which apply across the EU. Since 1979, MEPs are elected every 5 years by direct universal suffrage. That is, citizens choose them directly. The EU-wide minimum voting age is 18, with the exception of Austria, where it is 16. Elections are secret. The aim is to appoint the 751 MEPs who will make up the European Parliament for the next 5 years. They represent the interests of all of Europe's citizens. The number of MEPs per member state is proportional to its population size. However, there is a minimum of 6 MEPs per country and a maximum of 96. The means of standing as candidate and the minimum age to run for election varies between countries: 21 in Belgium, 23 in France, and 18 in the rest of Europe. Once elected, each MEP joins a European political group according to his or her political view. With the new balance of power in the Parliament's hemicycle decided, the work can commence for those representing Europe's citizens.
Thomas, next month, May is a very important month. Obviously, it's the parliamentary elections here for the European Parliament. And for our viewers watching, why is it so important that they actually get out there and vote? And why is this parliamentary elections so important for the next 5 years for what happens here in terms of policy formation in the European Parliament?
Well, if I answer your second question first, I believe the next years will be very decisive. Those with a concern for the Middle East peace process, it's very clear that we are entering a new unprecedented phase in that evolution. And as was made perfectly clear yesterday at our meeting at the European External Action Service, if you listen to John Kerry, if you listen to Angela Merkel, the message is always the same, to say there's no way back to square one. If the peace process fails, and there are now indications that this is about to happen, this could happen, the pressure on Israel will be unprecedented. It will be enormous. Through marking of Israeli goods from the disputed territories to, of course, the guidelines are already there, to a number of other policy initiatives will put Israel under a very difficult situation. So that is to say, in times like this, it's very important to have the right people here in the European Parliament voicing your concern, being good spokespersons for you, for the convictions that you have. And if we, for some reason, would not care to involve ourselves in this EU election or go to the polls in May from the 22nd to the 25th, we have no right to voice our opinions after the election day is over. And I think this is very clear. If we don't bother to vote, if we don't bother to do what we can do, we have no right to criticize after May 25. So let's be very clear.
And also, don't you think that so much has happened since the last European elections back in May of 2009? Mm-hmm. The fact that we've seen emergence of far-right political parties, we've seen the emergence of more nationalistic parliaments emerge. So we could actually see that many people will probably use these European elections in their domestic country to punish their own governments who are actually in power as a kind of protest vote. Yeah. And that could mean that we have a very peculiar or interesting mix in the next parliament.
Yeah. Well, over the last elections, we've seen the turnout going down. I think last election it was around 40%, which is very low. And it means exactly what you are saying. It means that those who feel motivated to go and vote are those who vote just out of a protest, usually protesting against their own government. What we see, and we now have a very good polling system, so you can follow from week to week what the predictions are. And we now see that it looks like 1/3 of the whole 751 members of parliaments here could be considered extremists, either right-wing or left-wing extremists. And this is, of course, a very different picture and outlook from 5 years ago. We still had, and that was the first indications in 2009, that we had these neo-fascists who were voted into the European Parliament, who openly denied the Holocaust, who have expressed admiration for Hitler, suddenly being in the European Parliament. And in the name of democracy, there's nothing we can do to stop it. So that only means that if we, people with decent values, believing in democracy, believing in rule of law, believing in minority rights, if we don't vote, someone else will. And this will shape the political landscape here in the European Parliament in a way which is very much against our values, which is very much against the State of Israel and the Jewish people. Because interestingly, what you see very often forming an alliance between the extreme left and the extreme right is this strange cohesion when it comes to disliking the Jewish people in Europe and equally disliking the Jewish state Israel.
And also there's a great danger that we could see in the results for this forthcoming elections. For example, the Jobbik party, the far-right political party in Hungary, make huge gains. I think they won 20% of the vote in the recent Hungarian elections, which is very concerning, with a kind of more moderate message, kind of a wolf in sheep clothing. And then we got the Golden Dawn party in Greece that could emerge, as well as groups like I think the BNP in Britain are on the last legs, essentially. I don't think they're going to do very well in this election. But it is concerning the number of far-right fascist groups that could have parliamentary representation here in the European Parliament. And what sort of problems do you think that will cause if our own supporters don't get out and vote for more moderate and balanced candidates in this election?
Well, as I said, you know, if we don't vote, it doesn't mean that the others are passive. The others and the extreme parties are very good at mobilizing their people at times like this. And that's why it's so important to get our message across, that, you know, even if you don't have a strong opinion on issues, because when you're an extremist, of course you have very strong opinions, you know exactly how all the problems will be solved, and you have easy solutions, and you can easily be mobilized. When you are more, as you said, moderate, you're centrist, you know, center-right, center-left, you know that life and politics is more complex. So it's always a little bit more difficult to say, well, you know, who should I vote for? But I think the message that we need to get across to the constituency in Europe right now is to say that we are now in a battle for the soul of Europe. What kind of Europe do we really want to have? Do we want to have a Europe which is reasonable, which is open for debate, which is open for, as I said, minority rights, remembering our past, the Holocaust, ready to take a stand against anti-Semitism? Or do we want a Europe of the past? And when I mean the past, I mean the dark past of Europe, which sadly we know it has been there, and we often sit in this program and discuss, well, how could it happen in Germany? Listen, we are now reliving what could be the beginning of the 1930s, when we see similar type of rhetorics, similar type of personalities out there. And now is our 1933 moment.
Which is something to ponder and actually reflect on, Thomas, which kind of leads me to say that maybe, we've got an opportunity here to really kind of reflect on where we are in 2014 with the forthcoming European parliamentary elections. And maybe we can actually ask certain questions. Is there something fundamentally wrong with the European Union? As we're seeing in my own native country, in Britain, the rise of the UK Independence Party that look to do very, very well in the forthcoming elections, because people are becoming increasingly concerned about the incursion of the European Union into every aspect of national life. So on the one hand, we're seeing, I believe, more power and authority being given to the EU and to the Commission. We're seeing the weakening of the European nation states. At the same time, I think there's a growing awareness or backlash amongst the European people themselves and the member states that their freedoms are being eroded. So surely at some point, member states across Europe should give the people an opportunity to have a referendum to decide the future of Europe, and that's got to be the key. Surely power has to reside with the people rather than with institutions, otherwise democracy itself is under threat and our very value systems or our very freedoms are under threat.
Well, thank you, Simon. These are the type of discussions that each one of us need to have, and regardless of what conclusion we reach, a few points that I'd like to make. I think it's one, yes, it's very important to say it publicly. It's okay to dislike the European Union. It's okay to be a EU critic. And that should not automatically be compared to being xenophobic or racist and extreme in any way. So let's make this point very, very clear. Part of democracy means that we can be of another opinion. So when we speak about extremism, we are not looking at to what point people want a more federal Europe or to what point they want a more decentralized Europe. That's a separate discussion, a very important discussion. When we talk about extremism, we talk about, and that's where it becomes, of course, a little bit complex, because many of the extremists also use the European Union as a scapegoat. To say, if you look at Jobbik or if you look at Greece, and it's combined, of course, with the financial crisis.
Absolutely.
So you say, well, the problem in the world is not that we are overspending in our particular country, not that we are not being completely honest, but we have these multinational organizations such as the EU or the IMF that are coming, imposing on us these restrictions, which austerity means, which means that we have to cut down on budgets, people lose their jobs. And this is a very complex and tricky situation where I think it can easily backlash towards anything to do with European cooperation, anything to do with international institutions. So we need to keep these issues very, very separate. But the general debate to say, well, do we want more of Europe or do we want less of Europe, I think is a legitimate debate where we can be of different opinions, but the debate that needs to take place now before the 25th of May.
I mean, if we look at some of the benefits of being in the European Union, despite the cost of membership, clearly those benefits are like free trade for European member states, free borders and free movement of people. So anyone can come across and work anywhere within the European Union. We got free access to borders, free trade. But isn't there a great danger when, if we move towards a more federalised Europe, and let's make no mistake that is where the founding fathers of the European Union in the Treaty of Rome wanted to establish, that if that is the vision, then surely maybe this is the time that the people of Europe had an opportunity to actually have a referendum and say, do we want to give our own independent nations to give more sovereignty to a Europe that seems to be very out of touch in the world and seems to be very much like an analogy that I would use of the European Parliament, its institutions. It's like the story of the king who's got new clothes on. He goes out and parades his new clothes until a boy mentions the fact that he's actually naked. That without this whole concept of a soft power, and that Europe has emerged because it's a trading bloc, and clearly Europe has played a great role in world history, means that Europe takes a more superior role to that of the United States. But if you can't back it up with military power, you can't back it up by economic power, what power are you anyway? Because you can't enforce policies, you can't enforce your will upon the world because you've got nothing to back it up with. So surely maybe this could be an opportunity, this election, to ask the candidates what their position is in terms of are they for a federalist Europe, or are they for a decentralised Europe, or do they favour pulling out of Europe altogether?
Thank you. It's very important, of course, at this point to make clear what is the mandate and the call of ECI, the European Coalition for Israel. And for us, we are, in this respect, we are very pragmatic. We know the European Union is a fact. I don't think, realistically speaking, that it's going anywhere. It's not going to dissolve, I think. So for us, the question is the same as has been the question in history for Christians. What do we do with a particular power structure that we have? It can be an ideal structure, but no structures are ideal. We know that. Not even democracy in its purest form is ideal. So we have to work with the structure that we have, and usually I make the comparison to personalities that we all know and admire. We think of Joseph in Egypt, we think of Daniel in Persia. I don't think most of us would not be very keen on Egypt in the times of Joseph, to say it was an excellent state with lots of human rights, minority rights, democracy. It was nothing of that. It was a dictatorship in its worst possible form. Still, the biblical mandate, and I think this is what is relevant, most relevant for us, the biblical mandate was still that Joseph was there to serve as a finance minister. So that raises a number of questions, I think, in our Christian thinking as well, to say, well, if Egypt was good enough for Joseph, if Persia was good enough for Daniel, maybe the EU, in all its imperfections, is okay for our smaller, minor prophets. And that doesn't mean that we cannot have and should not have this discussion, what should the EU be like? Should it be more? Should it be less? Personally, I think it should be less. But I think the fundamental question, the reason why we are here, and we will be here again after the elections are over, is simply because we believe we need to be where decisions are made. That doesn't mean that we give our approval and say, well, we are doing PR work for the European Union. Of course we're not. But we need to be here. And we also need to be grateful, I think, for the fact that we are still living in an unprecedented time in European history when it comes to peace and prosperity. And we are living in a time where people like you and I, Simon, can be in the heart of the European Union, expressing our opinions, disagreeing with EU policies, and we are being well taken care of by these very same institutions. So I don't think we should lose perspective in the things that we have to be grateful for, and also the things which are the most important ones in the European Parliament. And that is to say, well, where is my Joseph in Britain? Where is my Daniel in Britain, or be it Finland or Romania, who I believe is the person for this time, to be sent to Brussels, to be that spokesperson in the European Parliament? Because when you're a member of European Parliament, you have a very unique position. You can basically call up any government minister in Europe just by being a member of Parliament and say, well, this is something I'd like to pass on to you. This is my opinion. And they will listen to this person. They may not listen to you or to I or to some of our viewers, but when you're a member of European Parliament, potentially you have a huge platform. And that's why it's so important, even if it would be just one person, like Joseph, like Daniel, that we give our support to these people so that they are elected into the European Parliament.
No, absolutely. But I think we also got to recognise as well one of the issues that we're facing in Europe, and this also affects very much the excellent work you're doing and part of the European Coalition for Israel and raising a voice here in the European Parliament amongst its institutions, is the fact that what we're seeing clearly in Europe is a clear departure from our Judean Christian heritage. And it's almost taken on militant secularism And particularly we've seen so many, on so many social issues, the EU guidelines that have actually threatened Christian livelihoods and freedom. So is there a way that we can interact with the European Union and its institutions while also defending our own personal liberties and freedoms, which seem to be a threat, including press freedoms as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point is, again, that, you know, we want to... The European Union is basically an open space, you know, that will, through democracy, will bring in anyone with any conviction who wants to shape Europe, to have a stake in the game, to be at the table. And therefore, it's, there are no excuses to not getting engaged, not to vote. But just to go back to, because the discussion reminds me a little bit of 1994. We had elections in Sweden, in Norway and Finland. The big question was, should we join the EU or not? And of course, again, you could be of different opinions. But one point which was often made was this, to say, well, listen, the EU is such an ungodly place. It's so secular, it's so humanistic. You know, Sweden or Norway or Finland should have nothing to do with the European Union. At the time, and I'm a political scientist, so I sometimes try to look at these things from an objective point of view, I would make the observation to say, well, at that time, Swedish or Norwegian policy on particular issues that we have strong feelings about as Christians, family policy, were way more ungodly, if you want to use that word, than what was the case in the European Union at the time. And I think if we would turn around the discussion and said, well, where, be it Britain or be it any other major European country, if we look where our nations are going, regardless of many times the European Union, I think we are in a critical state anyhow, and dissolving the European Union will not really address those major structural questions in society. So I think what I'm saying is that I think everyone should be critical of political power, be it national power or European Union. So I am critical, but I think we also need to give honor where honor is due and recognize the achievements, and that's a balancing act.
Yeah, no, you need balancing acts, but you know, this is essentially the job of this is what journalism's about. It's actually protecting the rights and the freedoms, and actually scrutinising those in power to ensure that the individual freedoms and liberties are protected, and that's what democracy is about, and that's why freedom of press is so important. But on another more practical issue and discussion, Thomas, in terms of the candidates, and people will, and our viewers will be looking at their local candidates who will be standing in their constituency in the European Parliament, which is done on a proportional representation, looking at how can they actually look to find out what particular candidates' stance are on particular issues. So if we say there's a MEP standing and he takes a pro-Israel stance, how can we find his stance on so many of the issues that affect Christians and issues that Christians are concerned about?
Yeah, good point, and this is very important, because I would say that democracy and elections are not only about going to vote on that Sunday, as it is in Finland.
We have ours on a Thursday.
Well, okay, let's make that clear in Britain. But to be involved in the whole process, because this is a unique opportunity for many of us, the only opportunity in 5 years to meet with the candidates, to invite the candidates to a discussion, a debate, and they're eager to come anywhere now just to meet with potential voters. To use social media just to get back with them by email or any other form of communication, to ask these very questions. Because it will do two things. It will inform the electorate. You will know where your candidates stand, but it will also send a signal to the candidate. Wow, these are questions which are of concern for the voters. And I think if there's no other practical recommendation that we could give in this program, this would be the recommendation. Engage, raise these questions, send emails. You know, if you're a senior citizen, you may have more time to do so than others, but take the time and write down the questions which are important for you. And then you go through the list of candidates and you just simply send them these same questions, and that will be a very important input into their campaign, because they will listen and they will take note. And as we said, you know, European elections often are not the elections where you have a very high turnout. It's not a lot of activities. So your activity will have a multiplied effect, because it's not a turnout by 80%, but by 40%. So the more active you are, proportionally, you will have even more of an influence. As ECI, we will identify a number of questions that relates to the Middle East and to Israel that we are sending to the political groups here in the European Parliament. And once we get the answers, we will post them on our website, ec4i.org. So people can go there and at least get information on where the political groupings in the European Parliaments, where they stand on issues related to Israel. Because once you have a candidate who gets elected in, he belongs to a particular party at home, he will then have to join a group. So you can easily, say if it's a social democrat, there is a group for social democrats in the European Parliament. If you're conservative in Britain, or if you're if you're conservative in Britain, you belong to a particular group here, the ECR group in the European Parliament. So by simplifying, we will ask them, where do you stand as a group on these issues? So it will then inform the electorate to know, well, if my candidate gets elected, he will be in this group, this is where they stand. And I think now when we have 28 member countries with all those candidates, instead of being able to from a centralized way screen all of them, I think it's even better that we try to mobilize our constituency to get really active in this process.
Because, I mean, here's an opportunity, I think it only comes every 5 years, doesn't it? An opportunity to actually vote in a member of the European Parliament. And for the majority of our national media, national focus, it's our own national parliaments, because most people think, well, that's where the policies are made, that's where the decisions made, that's where the legislation is passed, and that's where everything's governed from. Yeah. But I think the realisation is that we have to educate ourselves and inform ourselves more about what's happening here in Brussels, because has implications for what happens back home. So how can we understand, and how can our viewers learn something more about how the European Parliament works? Because essentially the European Parliament itself has very little power in comparison to national governments. And certainly doesn't have a great deal of influence over the EU Commission. I know they have influence over the budget and they can raise questions, but this Parliament itself doesn't actually have the power to actually pass legislation like in national governments.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned in the beginning of the program, with the Lisbon Treaty, you can say there's a gradual change towards more power and influence for the European Parliament. And today we have this co-decision procedure, which means that a large chunk of policy decisions has to be done in collaboration with the European Parliament. So the reality is complex. It means that the European Parliament is not a traditional parliament that has legislative powers exclusively, but they work in close cooperation with the European Commission. And I think it's important to mention three areas. The budget. It is the European Parliament that will have to approve of the EU budget. It's just an enormous power to be able to say, well, looking at the budget and to say, well, you know, we think there should be more money here and less money there. And you know, when the EU budget is very significant when it comes to the Middle East peace process. And I think to look at a very concrete issue, to say if we want members of parliaments who can have an insight and have an input into how that money is spent, because we discussed it so many times in this program. We should make sure that they are in the European Parliament, they're in the Budgetary Control Committee, because that way they will have more power than any national government in Europe in controlling the EU budget. But also looking at the Commission, you know that each member of the Commission will have to be approved by European Parliament, and that's again is very important. Also, when it comes to formulating human rights policy of the European Commission or European Union, the Parliament has a strategic role. So we should not neglect the growing importance of the European Parliament.
Thomas, down to the last 8 minutes or so of the programme, give you an indication of how far the programme's going and how it's flowing. I think it's also important to look at the next Parliament once the elections are over. What do you think are going to be the key foreign policy issues that affect the EU's relationship with Israel and also the Middle East in the coming months and years for the next Parliament?
As I said in the beginning again of the program, I think the peace process is entering uncharted waters. What the quartet, what the world powers seem to be saying is that, you know, if Israel and the Palestinians fail in this process, it will be a completely new ballgame. I said this a number of years, that I think what I see on the horizon is a solution which will not be a negotiated solution, but something that will be imposed by the international community. Because we heard it so many times, it's on the record. Basically, you have either the quartet, or you have the US, or you have the EU saying, well, listen, guys, we give you one more year. We give you one more chance to solve it through negotiations, because that's the ideal way to solve a conflict. But if you fail, we just have to solve it ourselves. And then we'll impose something. So what I can see as a scenario, a very likely scenario, is that we are soon entering a phase where the international community will say, well, and we already know what the parameters are. You know, dividing Jerusalem, creating a state, alongside the 1967 lines, with no real minority rights for the Jewish people. And we see all the scenarios that could develop from such a fragile state building. So we know what's in the pipeline. And that's why I believe it's so important in this new season that we have strong political personalities. And a member of European Parliament has more clout than just being one of 751. He has more clout even outside of this Parliament building in being a recognizable voice. So this is also to answer the question, well, why should we vote? We should identify, we should look for those people who have the courage, capabilities, social skills to get their message across. Obviously, to mention another issue that we can't ignore, Iran.
Absolutely.
We haven't discussed it. It hasn't been in media. There's so many other questions, but still it's clear that the deal that they thought they had together in Geneva, it didn't work. People are not talking about it. The Iranians are moving ahead with their in their process of acquiring nuclear capabilities. And there's nothing that the international community will really do about it.
And also, I think going back to the future of the peace process, and you talked about possibly the United States, the Quartet, the EU actually posing a situation on the Israelis and the Palestinians. Isn't there also a great danger that what we could see is that certainly the involvement of NATO and EU peacekeeping troops actually there to actually enforce, which would really internationalise the conflict as it currently stands? And surely is this not a kind of bad reflection when we're seeing, with the emergence of the Arab Spring over the last few years, the rise of radical, extreme Islamist groups coming to power in the Middle East, that this makes it very dangerous? That on the one hand, Mohammed Abbas may be here now and he's approaching his 79th birthday. I think it's nearly 79. He can't go on forever. Who replaces him as the next leader of the Palestinian Authority? And can the Palestinian Authority survive in the growing support for Hamas in the Palestinian territories? So if Israel makes peace with Fatah and Mohammed Abbas today, who's to say that peace will be there tomorrow? And surely is this not something that the EU should actually take on board and consider?
Absolutely, and it has been stated many times, this is exactly our concern that we're trying to raise here at the European Union. Sadly, I think there's a high level of naivety and not knowing history. As we said in 1948, when the Jordanians annexed Eastern Jerusalem, there were all these guarantees from the international communities that this could never happen. But of course, we know what first thing that happened, that they all pulled out. The same happened on the border of southern Lebanon just a few months ago, when there was someone was shooting a little bit, and the UN troops from a particular nation got nervous and said, well, we are withdrawing. So who would ever believe that the international community, be it NATO or the UN, would once the heat is there, that they would stay on? I don't believe so. Just one point I want to make, because it relates to the peace process, and it's something which is very often stated now by the quartet. See, we often are critical of the approximately 500 million that the EU is donating every year to the Palestinian Authority. But we also know that without that money, the authority would collapse overnight. The first time I heard this in New York by the country that chairs the donors committee to the Palestinian Authority, they said, well, listen, this is our last chance. What we will do is, if there's no peace 1 year from now, we're just going to withdraw. We're not going to throw in money, hundreds of millions year after year, if it doesn't lead anywhere. So we also have to look at the scenario where the international community may say, well, this is our way of punishing the Palestinians. We're not going to fund you anymore. And of course, if you look at the instability that this will create in the situation today, when the international community will pull out their support, that's almost a declaration of war. But so we should remember as well, when we criticize the funding, that without that funding, the situation would be completely different. But all of this is something that could change within the next 6 months. And as the new parliament is coming into place, which will happen in June. So it's only to underscore the urgency of the hour. This is the time for us to pray. We call our campaign Pray and Vote, to pray for the election, pray for the right people to get elected, and pray for those who get elected anyway, but also to vote.
Thomas, I just want to thank you so much for joining me on today's Middle East report. It's been very informative and very, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank you all for watching today's European report, as we've discussed the forthcoming European parliamentary elections. And it's important that we go out there and vote. It's important that we actually check and understand the issues that surround this election, that we identify which each candidate stands for, what their belief systems are, what their policies are, so that we can actually elect the right people to the European Parliament. And it's important that for the next Parliament that there are strong supporters of Israel, that they are encouraged and they are supported, and that's your role and that's your responsibility. So we want to thank you today for watching today's European report here in the heart of the European Union in the Parliament in Brussels.